Yes, what is up? Welcome back to another episode by the FPL Draft Duo. And as you can see on screen, today we are looking at the top 5 tips for dominating the draft night. These are essential whether you are a beginner or an expert. I have to remind myself of them every year. So if you want to excel, listen up. Okay, so tip number 1, and in my opinion, it is the most important tip, and that is set your watch list. If you are new to the draft, the watch list is essentially a list of players that you can put in order. And that order is important for 2 reasons. First reason is that if you are idle on draft night, it will automatically pick them in that order. So let's say you get first pick and you have Palmer number 1. If you're not active and the timer runs out, Palmer will be picked for you. So that is important, but assuming you are going to be there, it also makes it very, very clear in your head what you want to do on draft night. So setting this up prior to the draft is essential. You might spend a couple of days doing this, you might do it an hour or two before the draft. My recommendation is spend a bit of time at it because it's going to save you an awful lot of hassle when the draft takes place and save you an awful lot of stress. So this is your Bible. This is what you should be basing everything off because you've already done your judgment and then you just have to play it depending on how the draft night goes. So as you see on screen there, I have that the minimum that I think you should have on your watch list is the number of managers in your league multiplied by 15. Very simple, 15 players per team. So you want to have yourself fully covered. If there's 10 managers in your league, and there's 15 players picked on each of those, and you have minimum 150 players, you're probably going to be covered. So I would imagine that you are on draft night, who would you actually pick? And it kind of links in with my last point. Yes, we want to win, that's our whole goal, but you have to understand that there's an element of fun that you can have with the draft because you can't own any player at any time. For me, it's Bruno Fernandes. He's my soft spot because I'm a United fan. I love to have him in my team so that when I watch United, I can enjoy Bruno and United. And if Bruno does well, United do well, it's double whammy. It can be detrimental sometimes to your overall score, but that's okay. It's a game at the end of the day. So your watch list is your bread and butter. This is what you should be basing all of your picks off. And if not done, it's going to get very confusing and you're probably going to end up with a subpar team. So tip number 2 is to go into the draft night with a plan. You will see that a lot of these tips will follow on from each other and they will connect in. Number 1, have a watch list. Number 2, go in there with a plan. So you need to go in there level-headed with a plan. It may change, but at least you have a plan. You may find yourself going for forwards and then leave yourself light midfield or vice versa. So having a general plan in your head is going to be key. And as I said, we are going to be doing loads of videos and podcasts on what we think is the best plan. But one thing that I think helps, I suppose, implement that plan is to pick based on your positions. And so as you can see on screen there, you can also set your watch list to particular positions. So if I'm looking at just forwards, I can click that filter on my watch list and I can just see forwards. So if I'm prioritizing a forward, which will be the next tip, at least I can see them. If I then have picked a forward and I want to look at my midfielders, instead of getting confused by my midfielders and forward ranks and maybe then going for a second forward and leaving myself light in my midfield, I can filter by midfielders. The next step on from that, as you can see, is to also continuously refer back to your selected players. So this comes back to the point where you might actually end up with 3 forwards and no midfielders, and then for the rest of the season you're struggling, you have maybe 1 good midfielder and then you're consistently wavering in and out players. So make sure you have that balance. Prioritize a forward, then go for your midfield, but you can help yourself doing this by filtering position. When you're ready to go to a defender, boom, click on filter and look at the defenders in order, rather than having them defenders jumbled up with forwards and midfielders and possibly getting confused. Tip number 3 was mentioned in tip number 2, but prioritizing a forward in the draft is so important. If you've played the draft before, you know this. You will probably know this after your first ever draft. But if you haven't, you need to understand that, as I have written down here, there's probably only around 15 starting forwards in the whole game. That might go down, that might go up throughout the season. But if you don't prioritize a forward, and if you go maybe 2 and 3 rounds without a forward, when you come back to pick a forward, you will be hit with reality, and you'll be looking at forwards that play for poor teams, might not be guaranteed to start. So you're going to have to look at those in maybe, ideally, round 1 and 2. Round 1, 2, if you get to round 3 without a forward, that is the time. If you go to round 4 without a forward, the pool is going to be so small, and the level of players in that pool is going to be very poor. So the top tip is to get one early, and once you have one of those forwards in maybe the first or second round, third at the latest, you can then focus on balancing the rest of your team, and you're not under pressure to go back and get a forward at the later stages. Tip number 4 is to minimize the amount of differentials that you end up picking on draft night. Now, I have been a victim of this before, and this is because you're excited at the prospect of picking someone up that could be fantastic. You're looking at someone who scored a goal or two in preseason, and you're thinking, I'm going to get this under the radar. So for me, I like to have a couple of players that I have as under the radar picks. Now, you might have upwards of 10 to 12 picks that fit this category. Smith Rowe going to Fulham, or Minte for Brighton, who has had a fantastic preseason. But that doesn't mean you have to pick them all. So again, tying back with my previous point of monitoring your team as you go along and noticing, oh, I've already picked one of these already. Let's go for a more solid pick. That is essential. What I sometimes find can happen is, again, you're caught up on the draft night. You're looking at these players that are still available, and you're thinking, oh my God, I'm going to pick him up. I remember I had him on my radar, and he's kind of in your head as a player to pick. By the end of the draft night, you look back at your team when the final pick is selected, and you realize you may have 3 or 4 of those players. And when it comes to game week 1 and you're setting up your team, you're realizing, I have 2 or 3 rotation risks in my team. And you will realize in the draft very quickly that all 15 players are so important. Because you want to take advantage of fixtures and possible injuries, you're going to have to play all your players. It's not like a 4.5 midfielder that will rarely come on your team. All 15 players are going to be super, super important. So, as I said, pick maybe 1 or 2 differentials. Have the base of your team as set, guaranteed starters. Now, I'm not saying they have to be boring picks, but try and increase the amount of decent attacking picks that are going to play the majority of minutes for those teams, and then also have your 1 or 2 differentials thrown in there. But minimize the amount, and always be aware of your team structure as you're going through the draft night, or as I said, you will come to the end and you realize there's 4 of these players that in a couple of weeks' time might not start for their team. And our final tip, pick keepers late. It is statistically a bad decision to pick up a keeper early, even if they're playing for the top teams in the draft. I think this is something that you only realise after you've played a couple of years of draft, or a couple of rounds of draft, that going for, let's say, an Alisson, as I have in the example that I'm going to explain, is not a good decision. So it looks like a bit of an equation on the screen, but I'll explain in a second. So a lot of players like to, I suppose, the idea that they have is that if I pick up an Ederson or an Alisson in round 6, 7, 8, it's essentially like picking up a defender. So when people are picking up a Ruben Diaz or a Guardiola, you're saying, I'm going to wait a pick or 2 and I'm going to get Ederson. And it's going to be the same thing, but it's not. Keepers' ceilings are very, very low. They can't get assists essentially. They're not going to get goals. They can only get save points and penalty save points. And this year it's massive because FPL have changed bonus points where you actually are minus more points for conceding a goal. and there's less points for penalty saves. So even if your keeper does get a penalty save, it's now reduced from 15 to 9 points on the bonus point system. So there's even less scope for keepers to get points in FPL this year, which makes them less relevant. Couple that with the fact that top level keepers rarely have to make saves, or at least don't have to make half as many saves as even the relegated teams. So it might seem counterintuitive, but going for lesser or poorer teams' keepers could get you more points in the long haul. And you may look at the stats from last year and say, well, Alisson scored more points than Verbruggen, and say that that theory is wrong. But the difference between points is very, very small. If you think about the difference between an average to poor team's midfielder compared to a top level midfielder of a top team, it's huge. It could be double points, if even triple points. But on the keepers, it might be 30. So the range of points is very, very small. So does it make a huge amount of difference even if Alisson outscored a low level keeper? But on screen is an example of how you actually maximize the amount of points you can get, and you can outscore them top level keepers. So if we look at the two managers, and we're looking at manager A and manager B, and what players they pick and what round. We look at manager A and they pick Alisson in round 7. Let's say Alisson gets 160 points, kind of an average points tally for a goalkeeper, and manager B picks John McGinn. Now John McGinn scores 150 points. Alisson outscores him. So based on that particular round, manager A has won. But if we continue on and we go all the way down to around 13 and 14, even 15, this is where I'd be recommending to pick keepers. If you can, if they're available, I would go 14, 15. Now, sometimes you might be forced to go slightly earlier, but no earlier than round 12. Even when you see keepers be taken, I wouldn't panic, because what tends to happen is people go for a keeper, a load get taken, and then they stop. So round 13, 14, 15, this is the time to be targeting your keeper. So let's look at manager A and their tactics, and let's see or imagine where they were on draft night. Round 7, picked Alisson, they were happy out. When it got to round 13 or 14, they may have their second keeper picked, or maybe they go for a Kelleher, who, subs in once or twice a year. Now they are looking for a fifth choice midfielder. So they have 3 midfielders, they have everything sorted apart from 2 last midfielders. And the pool of midfielders is very, very low at this stage. All the good ones have been taken. Yet there's some decent keepers that are still left. So they go for De Cordova-Reid. He scores 95 points in the year. Again, these are all examples. And goes for Harry Winks, 100 points. So they're fairly low scoring positions. And maybe by rotating them, or maybe getting some waivers in if you're lucky, you get 120 points out of that 5th midfielder spot. So 1 week he plays De Cordova-Reid, 1 week he plays Winks, and sometimes Winks returns and maybe he doesn't. And between the two of them, they get 120 points total for the year. Alisson gets 160, or let's say Kelleher subs in, and total they get 280 points combined with the goalkeeper position and the 5th choice midfielder position. Now let's look at manager B. When it was round 7, he picked John McGinn. Solid pick, decent score, 150 points. That was grand. When it came to the late rounds, 13 and 14, they were looking for their goalkeeper choice. And they picked Flecken, who scored 150 points, Muric, who scored 150 points. Now, both of these keepers, just to note, scored less than Alisson. So you're saying, well, I still bet them in terms of points for goalkeeping position, but you can rotate Flecken and Muric. And again, this is an example, but you can do this with loads of keepers. We will have cheat sheets up so you know what keepers to pick. Now, between the two of them, by rotating them for the good fixtures, you get 180 points. Now, you could just end up getting 150. But this is the tactic that usually will match, if not better, a top level keeper. So for your goalkeeping position and your midfield position combined, you could have got 330 points. So although in round 7, when you thought, well, Alisson will score more than John McGinn, because of the players that are left at them later rounds, you will actually lose out on points. So again, balance in your team. A decent midfielder at a decent time, and leave your keepers to the end, the last, if you can, the last two picks. That is how you maximize your points. If you adhere to these 5 rules, you're not going to go too far wrong. I know things can change on draft night. All keepers could be picked. Your watch list could get confusing. But if you put the time in prior to the draft, you keep these 5 tips in your head, you're not going to go too far wrong. And of course, if you're listening in throughout the year, you can get all the top waivers and dominate your league. FPL Draft Duo out. Boom.